So, good morning, Brian. Can you briefly introduce yourself and your work, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Brian Christian, and I'm a writer who writes primarily about kind of the broader human impacts of computer science. My first book's called The Most Human Human, which talks about my experience as a so-called human confederate during a Turing test competition, where I was tasked with acting as human as possible and trying to convince a panel of judges that I was not a machine. Um, and my second book, which is a collaboration with my good friend and the UC Berkeley cognitive scientist Tom Griffiths, is called Algorithms to Live By. And this really unpacks human decision making from a computer science perspective and says, what are the things that we can learn about how to make decisions differently in our own everyday lives by recognizing the parallels between some of the things that we encounter day to day and some of the canonical problems of computer science.
Yeah, and without a spoiler alert, but what would you say
Mm.
if you what's the message? What
Mm.
is it that you really want to get from, or you found out from writing these books?
Yeah, I mean, I think the deeper theme that runs throughout a lot of my work is just that I think computer science, starting in the middle of the 20th century and increasingly so today, gives us, I think, an incredibly powerful way for thinking about the human experience and what it means to be human. From a more philosophical perspective, one of the oldest questions in Western philosophy is what makes humans unique and distinct and special. And you can go back through the canon and read Descartes and Aristotle talking about this. And they tend to approach it from a perspective of, well, let's identify the traits that we have that we don't share with animals. And so there, when you start to take that approach, you get to things like abstract reasoning and deductive logic and so forth. I think in some ways, the story of the development of AI in the last 70 years is really turning that 2,500-year-old question on its head. Because we're now asking what is it that makes humans, unique and special from a perspective of how do we differ from machines, not how do we differ from our fellow animals. And you get a totally different set of answers when you ask the question that way. You care a lot less about abstract reasoning and deductive logic and the ability to play chess and to do math and things like that. And you care a lot more about the ability to empathize and be creative and be intuitive and so forth. And so I really think that we're being given this incredibly powerful lens into our own experience and the nature of the human condition. And so the second book kind of picks up and looks at this in pragmatic terms and says, we face all of these decisions day to day. Things like, I'm looking for a new apartment. How many places should I see before I'm willing to commit? Because I don't want to just get the first place that I see, but I don't want to hold out for some perfect option that never materializes. How do I find that balance, that intuitive balance between looking and leaping? Well, this corresponds to this class of problems called optimal stopping problems. And so we can actually mine the technical literature on those problems for, I think, a vocabulary, kind of a conceptual vocabulary, but also some surprisingly practical tips on how to confront these problems in our own life. And likewise, we have to deal with limited space and limited time. How do we wrangle our messy office or our storage closet? How do we prioritize our time? These are things too that initially feel like distinctively human problems, but in fact have these very profound, I would argue, parallels to some of the canonical problems in computer science around storage and management, caching, and so forth, and time management in terms of scheduling theory. So I think it's one of the powerful lessons that emerges from this is, we are not alone when we confront these problems. Computers, in fact, confront the direct analogs of a lot of these same problems. And so we can really bring the process full circle. Every algorithm designer, their first draft is just asking themselves, what would I do in this situation? But then computer science gives us this really powerful set of tools to optimize and refine and make provable statements about which of these strategies is better than the other. And so I think there's really an opportunity to bring that full circle and integrate some of the things that we've learned back into our own intuitions and use them in our own lives.
And what I'm hearing is that you've got, so on the one hand, being able to zoom out and actually seeing, again, putting the human back into technology, or, seeing that technology is just a tool, and how are we using this in kind of human development. And at the same time, by zooming in and seeing what can we learn from these machines and computers that we've been making, what can we learn about ourselves? So it's kind of like going, zooming in and zooming out at the same time.
Right. There's this sort of species level question of like, what does it mean to be a human being? And there's this individual, very granular question of, I'm confronting this situation, what should I do? And I think there are payoffs, at each of those scales, absolutely.
Yeah, and questioning, with the algorithms, I think the big thing for me, or what I've been looking at, like with Facebook, for example, I just watched an interesting video the New York Times just did about how Facebook is changing the internet, and about, with the algorithms and how it's creating, the echo chambers and stuff like that. But like, we are, in some ways giving our power over to these algorithms without questioning them, and they're actually having a massive impact on society, And
yeah, I think this is really going to be one of the narratives of the human race in the next 10 years. I mean, and as you say, we're already seeing it, which is that as we are increasingly delegating aspects of human decision making, whether it's what news you encounter when you open, your news feed, or it's things like deciding who should get a mortgage, or who should get parole, and who should get the longer or shorter sentence. Things like this that are increasingly being kind of turned over to these automated systems. We're being put into a position where we need to articulate our values and our desires and our goals in explicit, formal terms, which is not really something that we, I think, are especially good at. It's certainly not in a first pass. And so I think we're in a position now of getting kind of a crash course in how to start thinking about some of these intangible things that really motivate us, both as individuals and as societies. Things like justice, fairness, lack of bias, equality, that we have these intuitive understandings of what those concepts mean. Increasingly, we are being put into a position of needing to put those into explicit numerical or computational terms. And it's not always clear that we know what we're doing before we start to make that happen. So this is certainly something you see with consumer tech, whether it's Facebook or YouTube, for example. A lot of the changes to the YouTube user interface, let's say, are what's called A/B tested. And so they are rolled out selectively to a particular group of users, and it's used as basically an experimental design, where you have the control group versus the experimental group, and you're weighing empirically, do these changes to the layout or the interface make the product better or worse? And so the question that emerges here is, well, by what KPI are we determining better or worse? And I think in the case of YouTube, it has historically been minutes of video viewed per user per week. And so if you think about that, it is not entirely clear that building a machine that's optimized to consume as much of human attention as possible is actually what we really want. It's not necessarily what the company really wants. It's not necessarily what the users really want. And so we are, I think, confronting headlong this maybe it's not too extreme to call it a crisis, but we are really needing to think very seriously and in a hurry about, do the formalizations of our goals and objectives really match what we really want? And that, as you say, I think that's coming up all over the place.
Yeah, and I love what you're pointing to. Like this, we need to be explicit, because if we're not explicit, how does the AI actually make decisions? Right? It's then making it on
exactly.
false information because we haven't been explicit enough. And building on that, as you talk about with values and when we're going from that level, what are our values? Do we know what our values are? Because if we don't know it, and then we're not expressing it explicitly, then of course the world is being created in a way that we're not particularly happy with.
Yeah, I think anyone who has programmed a computer, let's say, has had this experience of, you think you know what you want, but all of a sudden you start encountering these weird edge cases of, even something in user interface design. What do I do if they've clicked this, but then that disables this other thing that they might want to, whatever. Or, in a back-end situation, there are all these edge cases around, what if there's a nil value, what do I do? And one often has this humbling experience of realizing how foggy one's initial conception was. And I think that is one of the nice things about software engineering and computer science, is that it really forces you to to come correct. Like if you have an intention, you have to be extremely clear about it, and you have to cross your T's and dot your I's, so to speak. And I think this is now being extended into kind of an ethical domain, where we now have machines that are making these, I would say, morally significant decisions. Whether it's a self-driving car, do you swerve and hit the puppy or the child or the disabled person, or do you crash the car and potentially harm the driver versus hit a pedestrian but keep the driver safe? Or again, in more abstract contexts around, where do you lay out the highway through a city, or who gets what credit card borrowing limit and things like this. Defining exactly what our priorities are. It's that same iterative process of discovering that you had a much less clear and crisp idea of what you wanted than you thought you did. But the stakes are much higher. So yeah, I think we are very much in this mode as a society of encountering these problems.
Yeah, and when you add on kind of time constraints and pressure and stress and all of these things, people start making decisions that are away from their values. That's human nature as well, and that just kind of is feeding the system, right? It's feeding it to kind of go off in a route that we don't particularly want to go.
Yeah, I think there is something very funny about even within a single individual person, there are these paradoxes in the way we make decisions. There's this famous example where, with Netflix, where people would create a queue of which Netflix movies they wanted shipped to their house. And people would always say that they wanted the critically acclaimed serious drama, but then in reality, what they would actually watch was the action movie or the rom-com or something like that. And so, the psychological literature is full of cases like this where people's stated desires diverge in some way from their kind of impulsive behavior. And again, this paradox or this slight divergence has been a part of the human psyche since forever. But we are now put into a position where we have to kind of explicitly optimize for the one or the other. And as as an engineer or a product manager or an executive, you have to make a commitment. Which of these two selves, if you will, are you really trying to serve? And so, this is just another example of how I think computer science is one of the most kind of philosophically relevant fields in recent decades, because it's bringing these things that just kind of festered under the surface to light, and is forcing us to make explicit commitments one way or another.
Standing in the knowledge and wisdom that you have, and when you face the future now, and you stand from, let's say, from possibility and positivity, what do you see, and what do you see? How does the algorithms and AI and machine learning, how does that all support it?
I think there's certainly a lot of fear mongering that goes around, and some of it I think is justified. But I think ultimately I'm a pretty optimistic person by nature, and I do think that there's a really positive thread that can be drawn out of this. And I think one of the things is that it enables us as a society to be a little bit more conscious and deliberate about what exactly we're doing together as a society, and a little bit more explicit and transparent. I do think, for example, there was a really interesting result that showed that if you train a machine learning model to mimic the decisions of a particular judge, then it could still factor in the idiosyncratic point of view of that particular judge and what they valued relative to other judges. So you can still preserve the kind of, I think, largely positive heterogeneity there, but it was more consistent. It didn't make different decisions at the end of a 10-hour day than at the beginning, or before lunch or after lunch. And I mean, that's just an anecdotal thing, but I think it really points to this idea that there are these positive, win-wins that are possible. And I also think that as far as consumer technology goes, I do think that end users have, on the one hand, a right to know what's being optimized for. I think a lot of times we encounter these highly optimized systems, whether it's the news feed or YouTube or Reddit or just about any major website nowadays. I think there ought to be something like a Bill of Rights that says, we need to at least know, what are you optimizing for? Like, what are the metrics that have driven the decisions that are being made and presented to me? And I'd like ideally to see people able to take the reins of that a little bit more and say, actually, my goal when I visit this site or use this app is slightly different. It's this. And I'd appreciate if you optimized for that, my explicit goals. And I do have an optimistic sense that as we move forward, we will be able to use machine learning in ways that are transparent, both to the engineers and to the end users, and come to some relative degree of consensus around what exactly we're trying to do, and feel confident that the system is furthering those goals. So I do see it as being, there's a very positive view of society, late 21st century society in which there's kind of a unprecedented degree of transparency and accountability around some of these decisions, rather than you just went to a judge and they were in this kind of mood and this thing happened, or they came to a certain determination, you'll never know why. We can have a world in which we can sort of unpack those decisions for people in a way that's hopefully satisfying and empowering. And say, okay, well, here's the model of the world that we're operating on. Here's the information that we have. And you can see how we arrived at the decision we arrived at. I think people will increasingly expect and perhaps demand that level of accountability. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from you, if I just replay it, is that then what's going through now and with AI and ML is that it's bringing it forward, this idea of being very clear with our values and what we believe in and all these things. And we need to go through this, and there to be a collapse, and for there to be, all of these things, because from that will come the transparency, right? Because transparency just doesn't come from nothing. There needs to be this kind of collision for the transparency to really be a need.
Yeah, I mean, obviously one hopes that the collision is minimized in certain respects, but I do think that we are passing through kind of a transitional phase where we are going through the messiness of human judgment in many cases to um, the drawbacks of, for example, contemporary deep learning systems are often inscrutable even to the people who design them, and it's very hard to trace how you got from the inputs to the outputs, even if you have access to the network. And this is, we're replacing one set of problems with another set of problems, but I do feel as though we are tacking, if you will, towards some kind of harmonious balance where, as the theory around machine learning advances, there's a lot of really exciting work into more interpretable and transparent architectures for machine learning. There's a lot of research funding and a lot of really smart people working on this problem. And that's one of the things that I'm really excited about, because it does seem like that's how we get the best of both worlds. Something that has the power and expressiveness of these more sort of black box, neural network systems, but is as transparent and debuggable, if you will, as the more sort of classical programming approach. It feels to me that there is a kind of Goldilocks, happy medium in there, that we will arrive at through that theoretical work, and it seems like it's going in that direction. That to me is a really encouraging trend.
So, as you know, the audience you're going to be speaking to are software developers. So, I'm just curious to know what impacts do you hope that you and your talk will have on the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I am often really encouraged to find when I speak, especially to a technical audience, people who have a familiarity with thinking algorithmically, thinking in big O notation or worst case analysis and so forth, they have this arsenal of conceptual tools at the ready, and in some ways, it's all I have to do is kind of highlight some of the parallels between the things that they're familiar with as developers and some of the things that they encounter in their human life that perhaps they didn't realize had this kind of computational dimension. So, for example, one of the things that I will get into is, this classic choice that we all make every night around, where to go out to eat for dinner or what to make. Do you just do your favorite thing that you always do, or do you try something new that you haven't tried before? Well, this bears a very striking resemblance to this classic computer science problem called the multi-armed bandit problem. And anyone who's worked doing A/B testing is familiar with all of these different algorithms. And so what I'm really trying to do is highlight this set of parallels and connections and give people the ability to kind of recognize and identify in their own lives, oh, I'm in a situation that kind of has this explore-exploit dynamic, or it has this optimal stopping dynamic, or it has this kind of overfitting regularization dynamic. And they already, in many cases, have the tools. And so now that they have the ability to identify these things and recognize them, they can bring all of that knowledge to bear, and have maybe a more refined vocabulary for framing the types of decisions they're making in their own lives. So that for me is really rewarding when I can kind of see those light bulbs going off in people's minds, especially people who already have that technical background.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing, it's like it's an integration, and really it's helping people becoming being themselves, but with more skill. Right? They're using,
exactly.
They're using the whole of themselves and this technical ability that they have. Use that in the complex part, which is actually being a human and having relationships and making all these decisions.
Yeah, that's very well articulated. Be yourself, but with more skill. And I think one of the messages of the book too is that there's this preconception that I think a lot of people have about what it would mean to live by the tenets of computer science or live in a sort of algorithmically rigorous or optimal manner. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions that some people have, especially non-technical people, that, oh, I don't want to never listen to my intuition or my emotion, or I don't want to become like a Spock-like, robot or something. In fact, I think one of the real themes of the book is that when you look at human decision making, you see that humans are almost always up against the hardest and messiest version of any theoretical computer science problem. We are always operating in these sort of like gnarly, intractable zone where you have time constraints, computational constraints, partial information, limited information. Maybe you don't know the distribution from which your information is being drawn. And in each of these cases, there is a set of strategies from computer science for kind of making progress amid all of that uncertainty or intractability. And they look a lot more like, intuitive human reasoning, using randomness, using approximations, following strategies that aren't guaranteed to work every time. And so I think that paints a picture of human rationality that's more kind of human and more achievable than this, than, for example, the picture you would get from, looking at the behavioral economics literature that paints this view of humans as just buggy and irrational and error prone. I think there's actually the view from computer science says that when you take computational constraints into account, a lot of the things that people do intuitively start to make a lot more sense. And there's a vision of what rational decision making looks like that's, happily a lot more achievable and a lot more familiar than we might imagine. So bridging that gap is another one of those thematic things that I hope to do.
Wonderful. I love when these gaps get bridged, because again, it's all about integration from all the different,
totally agree.
The messiness of it all. I love that you reframed it as messiness. We're in a messy phase right now. But from that,
I agree with that.
So kind of coming towards the end of our time together. So I'm just wondering if you could really summarize the essence of your message, like if you could do it in a couple of sentences, like really as a bit of a challenge to what is it that you
Sure.
Really when you wake up in the morning, it's like, yes, this is what I'm about, this is the message that I'm spreading at the moment.
I would say there's a set of problems that we each confront day to day. We think of these as intrinsically and uniquely human problems. They're not. In fact, they correspond to some of the biggest questions in computer science. And so recognizing that gives us the ability to bring insights from computer science to bear on some of the biggest and most important human questions that we face.
Wow. I can't wait for the talk. It sounds amazing. If I could get that would be so cool. And so on a second question, then, like the narrative. What is the narrative that you're kind of, you're wanting to kind of highlight, so that, as we are moving forwards, that, people are kind of catching on this narrative of what I hear of possibility and optimism, as opposed to one of fear and kind of that we're just going to end up in a big explosion.
I'm really grateful to the people who are out there kind of sounding the alarm bells around some of the things to be concerned about with AI. I used to be fairly dismissive of that, and as the years have gone by, I've become more and more convinced that there is reason to have that concern. And what I've seen gives me a lot of reason to feel encouraged, because what I'm seeing is people are really answering to the call. People are responding to that challenge. And I think in some ways we are at the beginning of one of the great interdisciplinary labors of humankind. What we're seeing now is really this coming together across disciplinary lines. It reminds me of the Fellowship of the Ring, where you've got, the dwarf, the elf, and so on, everyone bringing their unique skill, their unique weapon, and so forth. We're seeing the interdisciplinary version of the Fellowship of the Ring, where there's really this melding of the theoretical computer science community, the legal community, the public policy community, the social sciences. And people are starting to have these conversations, across, not only across academic departmental lines, but going outside of the academy altogether, and people in the research community are talking to people in industry, and they're talking to people in the public sector. And when I see a coming together of that magnitude, I can't help but be encouraged. I really think this is going to be one of the defining projects of certainly of the 21st century, if not of humankind. And we're really just at the beginning. So for me, that's kind of an exhilarating place to be. And so I'm fascinated to follow the story from here.
And I just want to underline that coming together. We don't know where we're going, and it's part of evolution, but it's that coming together which is where the power is. Absolutely
agree. Yeah.
So with that coming together, we're really excited to have you in Malmö in a couple of months, and just for you to come and spread this coming together would be amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm really looking forward to it.
So we'll see you in a couple of months.
Sounds good. See you then.
See you then.